For centuries, a single vegetable could feed an entire family for 15 years. Without replanting, without buying seeds, and without industrial intervention. Royal edicts mandated its harvest. Monasteries relied on its resilience to outlast famine and war. Yet today, almost no one remembers it. It was not lost to blight or neglect. It was systematically replaced. The true story of its disappearance reveals what the food system did not want you to keep growing or to remember. In the records of medieval life, a garden was not a private luxury. It was an obligation. Monastic inventories from the 13th century and the 14th century list the essentials with methodical precision: beans, cabbages, onions, and always the hardy perennials. These were not afterthoughts. In the Plan of St. Gall, a 9th century model for Benedictine monasteries, the kitchen garden is mapped as carefully as the chapel. Surviving garden rolls from Canterbury Priory and Durham detail rows of enduring greens and roots, plants chosen for their ability to withstand neglect, frost, and famine. Royal households operated on the same principle, but at scale. Ordinances for the English court in the 15th century specify the daily provisioning of vegetables for hundreds of mouths. The lists are practical, but the expectation is clear. The garden must provide, even when markets fail. In a 1322 seed list from the Archbishop of Canterbury's gardener, the inclusion of skirret, a perennial root, sits alongside onions and leeks, treated as a staple, not a curiosity. Household books from French and German estates echo this logic. A 1799 pamphlet from the Chelsea Physic Garden describes sea kale as a familiar food in Devonshire and Sussex, gathered for time immemorial and preferred above all other greens. In Chichester's market records from 1753, bundles of cultivated sea kale appear as standard fare, not specialty produce. Food historians studying these folios point out that these plants were not chosen for novelty or taste alone. Their value was security, a patch that returned every spring, no matter how harsh the winter or how empty the grain store. For monastic communities, for royal kitchens, and for the villages that supplied them, these perennials formed the quiet backbone of survival. The archives do not treat them as luxury. They are listed with the same regularity as bread or ale. Their absence would have been unthinkable, and yet over centuries, their names faded from the ledgers, replaced by crops that fit a different kind of economy. A single planting and the work is done. This plant settles in for the long haul, its roots reaching deep and wide, anchoring itself through drought, frost, and neglect. Each spring, new shoots rise, no coaxing needed, no annual digging or sowing. For a decade or more, the same patch can be counted on to produce season after season. Horticultural records confirm that established clumps remain productive for 10, sometimes 15 years, outlasting most garden commitments and even some property deeds. The resilience goes beyond mere survival. Every part of the plant is useful. Young leaves serve as early greens, tender enough for salads or soups. Shoots, blanched under a clay pot or a mound of earth, deliver a harvest that rivals asparagus. The stems can be cooked as a vegetable, the flower buds treated like miniature broccoli, and the seeds, if allowed to mature, ground or sprouted. Even the roots, while not always the star, can be eaten in lean times. This is not a specialty crop or a garnish. It is a full-spectrum food designed by nature to fill gaps when other harvests fail. There is no fixed harvest date. The plant offers itself in stages, allowing a family or community to take what is needed when it is needed. A few leaves today, a handful of shoots tomorrow, a cluster of buds next week. This pattern defies the logic of modern machinery, which demands uniformity and synchronization. Here, abundance is measured not by a single market-ready yield, but by years of quiet, continuous return. The gardener does not buy new seed each spring. The patch persists, quietly feeding generation after generation. In the ledger of survival, this is how security was once measured, not by what could be bought, but by what could be trusted to return, unasked, for years on end. Machines demand order. The row crop harvester, perfected in the mid-20th century, expects fields to behave like assembly lines. Crops must stand in perfect formation, every plant the same height, every pod or root ready at the same moment. Combines and tractors are calibrated for this choreography. One pass, one yield, one field emptied and reset for the next season. This perennial refuses that logic. It grows in clumps, spreading unevenly, sending up shoots and leaves on its own schedule. Some parts are ready in early spring, others in midsummer, some not at all. There is no single harvest window, no uniform flush of growth. For the operator in the cab, this is chaos. The machine cannot distinguish between new shoots and old stems. It cannot separate edible from spent. A field of these perennials cannot be cleared in a single sweep. Instead, the harvester leaves behind missed patches, torn roots, and half-harvested crowns. The next year, the plant simply returns, sprouting from fragments left in the soil, defying the notion of a clean field. Seed drills and planters, designed for annuals, require straight lines and measured gaps. This plant ignores those rows, filling space as it pleases, crowding out the neat geometry machines. Demand. Agricultural manuals from the 1940s and the 1950s describe the need for synchronized maturity and uniform stands. Crop trials report that perennials like this one complicate rotation schedules and reduce efficiency. Every deviation from uniformity slows the machines, raises costs, and frustrates the operators trained to expect predictability. In the economics of scale, unpredictability is failure. The plant's resilience, once its greatest asset, becomes a liability. It cannot be forced to fit the rhythm of industrial harvest. It survives, but only by opting out of the system that rewards compliance. For a century built on the promise of mechanical progress, this crop was simply too unruly to keep its place. In 1924, the federal government ended its public seed distribution program. It was a quiet but decisive turn in American agriculture. For decades, the USDA mailed millions of seed packets to farmers and gardeners, flooding the countryside with open-pollinated varieties, including perennials that needed no annual replacement. When the appropriations vanished, so did the last large-scale channel for seeds that did not require yearly purchase. Seed companies, newly unchallenged by a free public supply, began to reorganize their business around predictability. Catalogs from the late 1920s show the change on paper. In Ferry Morse's 1927 catalog, perennial vegetables and old standby greens shrink to a handful of lines, tucked behind pages of annuals promising uniform harvests and easy shipping. Where once a gardener might find a column for Good King Henry or perennial sorrel, the space is crowded with new annual hybrids, each branded for a single season's use. Prices tell the rest of the story. Annual seeds are cheap by the packet, but they require purchase every spring. Perennials, by contrast, ask for a single, slightly higher upfront cost and then nothing for years. An agricultural economist reviewing these catalog archives points out the math. A plant that feeds you for 10 years brings in a single sale. An annual, especially if it is a hybrid that cannot be reliably saved, guarantees a customer returns every year. The catalog becomes a ledger of incentives. As the 1930s approached, the logic of recurring revenue shaped what was offered and what quietly disappeared. Perennial vegetables, once common in both rural and urban gardens, faded from catalog covers and slipped into the margins. The business model had no place for a crop that refused to die on schedule. The official story is tidy. Mechanization, refrigeration, and the march of progress made perennial vegetables obsolete. In 1910, tractors began to shape the landscape, turning mixed gardens into regimented fields. By the 1940s, cold storage and refrigerated rail cars let crops travel farther than ever before. In 1952, large-scale vegetable harvesters rolled out, engineered for crops that matured all at once, in straight, predictable rows. These milestones are real. Industrial farming needed crops that could be planted, harvested, and cleared on a schedule. Uniformity was rewarded. Perennials, with their scattered growth and staggered yields, simply did not fit. But the argument does not end with machinery. The legal and economic structure behind the scenes mattered just as much. Most perennial vegetables, those that live for a decade or more, could not be patented under the laws introduced in 1930. The Plant Patent Act protected only a narrow range of asexually reproduced plants. Tubers, rhizomes, and most hardy perennials were excluded. Even after the Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970, the system still favored crops that required fresh seed each season. Annuals could be hybridized, branded, and controlled. Perennials could be divided and shared, slipping through the cracks of intellectual property law. Seed companies and economists often point to efficiency. Annuals are easier to standardize, easier to sell, easier to own. Yet the catalog record tells another story. As hybrid annuals took over the front pages, perennials were demoted to the back or vanished entirely. There is no need for a ban when the business model itself selects for plants that guarantee a return customer. Mechanization and cold chain logistics may explain the disappearance on the surface, but the final barrier was legal and economic. A crop that lives for 15 years cannot be patented, cannot be sold again and again, and so it is quietly replaced. The system did not just forget these plants, it made sure they would not return. In the kitchen, memory is written in recipes. Yet even memory can be rewritten. Mid-century cookbooks, once guides to survival as much as taste, quietly revised their pages. Where older editions called for perennial greens, those stubborn returning plants that anchored gardens for generations. Later printings offered substitutions. A 1950s British household manual, for example, replaces the springtime pot herb soup, once built on Good King Henry or sorrel, with annual spinach and store-bought parsley. The change is subtle, the name of the dish remains. The ingredient list shifts, and the perennial, with its deep roots and strong flavor, is edited out. The cook at the stove, following the latest edition, may not notice what is missing. The recipe works. The soup is green, mild, familiar, but the logic has altered. A dish that once relied on what returned every year now depends on what is purchased fresh each spring, creating a new dependence. The perennial, once a guarantee against hunger, becomes a footnote, a parenthetical suggestion, if available. In time, even that note disappears. This is how erasure happens, not as a single act, but as a series of small, practical decisions. The home cook, seeking convenience or following new advice, becomes an unwitting agent in the forgetting. The perennial patch in the garden is left to grow wild, or is dug up to make space for annual rows. The recipe, once a record of resilience, becomes a script for the supermarket age. The loss is quiet but complete, a flavor, a memory, a way of feeding a family, replaced by something less enduring. A living record sits in the margins, patches of perennial vegetables that survived every trend and purge. In the archives of the Chelsea Physic Garden, a ledger from 1799 lists sea kale and Good King Henry among the plants still raised for the table. The handwriting is faded, but the message holds. These were not museum pieces. They were meant for eating, year after year. Today, tucked behind old stone walls or in the untamed corners of monastery grounds, these plants persist. A heritage gardener points to a clump that has weathered 15 winters, its leaves pushing through last year's mulch. No special care, no annual replanting. The cost is a single packet of seed, often less than the price of a cup of coffee. $4, sometimes less. Some gardeners never bought seed at all. They simply took a division from a neighbor's patch. The cycle is simple. Plant once, harvest for years, then share a root or a shoot with someone else. The steps have not changed since the days of the kitchen garden rows. Dig a shallow trench, scatter the seeds or set the crowns, cover lightly, and water once. After that, patience does the rest. By the second spring, the patch is ready for picking. Leaves for soup, shoots for the pan, buds for the table. Each season, the plant returns undiminished. A curator at a seed archive runs a finger down the accession record, noting that some lines have been maintained in the same family for generations. The plant's durability is not theory, it is living proof. Where commerce demands turnover, this vegetable answers with continuity. The only requirement is to let it grow. A plant that could feed a family for 15 years from a single planting was never simply forgotten. It was systematically pushed aside. Year after year, the seed catalog shrank its presence, offering a single line where there had once been a column. Machines rolled out that demanded crops rise and fall on command. Recipes rewrote themselves, swapping the perennial's stubborn flavor for something milder, easier to buy, easier to sell. The business model found no room for a vegetable that did not need replacing, that could be shared from neighbor to neighbor, or divided from a single patch for generations. In a world where every harvest is measured by the sale, a plant that persists is a problem, not a product. The system did not need to outlaw it. It needed only to reward what could be standardized, patented, and sold again next spring. The perennial was not erased by accident. It was replaced because it worked too well. The modern food chain prizes dependency, annual cycles, repeat purchases, uniformity on the shelf. A vegetable that outlasts the system's schedule cannot be allowed to set the terms. That is why it vanished from the page, from the market, from the memory of most kitchens. Not because it failed, because it refused to fail on cue. Today, nearly 3/4 of global calories come from just 12 crops, most bred for uniformity and dependence. As food insecurity rises and climate shocks intensify, the forgotten perennials offer more than nostalgia. They offer resilience no supermarket can sell. The real harvest isn't in what we plant next, but in what we choose to remember. What else might we recover if we stop letting convenience erase abundance?